All right, A-Push scholars, welcome back to another. Hey, Beamer, where's the video? I don't want to hear you talk. I want to listen to some music. Well, actually, I think I got a special surprise for you.
Hey, do you know about the USA? Do you know about the government? Can you tell me about the Constitution? Hey, learn about the USA. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers did agree to write a list of principles for keeping people free. The USA was just starting out a whole brand new country, and so our people spelled it out, the things that we should be. And they put those principles down on paper and called it the Constitution. And it's been helping us run our country ever since then. The first part of the Constitution is called the Preamble and tells what those founding fathers set out to do. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare at hand, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Okay, that video was from Schoolhouse Rocks back in the 1970s and 80s. That was created, and that was about the Constitution. And that's what this second half of Chapter 9 is going to be about, the Constitution, the creation of it. And here are some key topics we are going to cover in this video. Okay, the first section of reading is called The Horrid Specter of Anarchy. And so anarchy means a revolt against the government, and there was one in 1786, not 18, but 1786. And that was Shays' Rebellion. We'll talk about that in this slide. So in the previous video, we talked about some economic problems after the revolution. People were deep in debt. There was high inflation, and some states were in trouble. And so they started to print their own money, which led to even more problems. And the biggest thing that happened was Shays' Rebellion. A must-know, highlight this, happened on the eve of the Constitution. You can make the argument that a big cause of the writing of the Constitution was this rebellion. It happened in western Massachusetts. It had to do with these backcountry farmers in Massachusetts, and unfortunately many of them were Revolutionary War vets, and they were losing their farms. They could not pay back their debts, and so the government was taking possession of their farms, and these farmers were mad. And so Daniel Shays leads this rebellion against the government, and their demands were cheap paper money so they could pay off their debts, less taxes, and fewer property takeovers by the government. A little more with Shays' Rebellion. This is the specifics of it. Daniel Shays, raised an army, and unfortunately three of his people, his men, were killed, and there was one wounded. So it was not a major rebellion in terms of death tolls. The movement did not work. It eventually did collapse, and he was later condemned to death, but he was pardoned, so he did not die from his rebellion. But the key thing is the result, and the result of Shays' Rebellion is that many Americans, especially the wealthy, were worried. They were worried that that could happen in other states as well. The poor, those that were deep in debt, would rise up against the wealthy property classes, and they would basically have a revolution like in France, which would lead to anarchy, which would be an overthrow of the government. And the biggest thing is that the Articles of Confederation showed that it was very weak because of this rebellion, and it was not strong enough to deal with these situations. We needed to have a stronger central government that could handle problems in all the states. All right, the next section is a convention of demigods, and this does not seem like a positive term, and actually is referred to negatively by Thomas Jefferson. So anyway, a convention at Annapolis, Maryland, called for a rewriting of the Articles of Confederation, and they decided to meet in Philadelphia in 1787. This convention is called the Constitutional Convention. Highlight this. It happened in the summer of 1787. And I would highlight also the next line. The purpose originally was just to change the Articles to make it better, and the purpose was not to create our new Constitution, but in fact that's what was created. And so 55 delegates met in Philadelphia from 12 states. Rhode Island, was not represented, those Rhode Islanders. Jefferson, in a negative term, called them demigods. He said these people, he was not too fond of a lot of the people at the convention, although they were many of America's finest statesmen. George Washington was unanimously elected the chairman or the president of the convention, and there was other important people there. Ben Franklin was there, James Madison, my boy Alexander Hamilton, and the more I think about it, I don't think it was my boy so much, but he did a lot of good things, but still, he was not a very nice person. I don't think Hamilton was really about relationships so much, unfortunately, but I think he was important to help lead to a stronger government, which was needed for the United States to work. And finally, there were many American leaders who were not there. Thomas Jefferson, he made the reference to the people there as demigods. John and Sam Adams were not supportive of the new Constitution. Thomas Paine, common sense. John Hancock, big signature. And Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. So there was a lot of important, powerful Americans not present, and many of these were not there because they were for states' rights. Now, I'd highlight this term. It's going to be a big term in the next several chapters of A-Push. States' rights people want smaller federal government, and they want the states to have most of the rights. The Articles of Confederation did give states a lot of power, but the new Constitution was going to limit that in favor of a stronger federal government. Okay, next section, Patriots in Philadelphia. A quote that describes the people at the Philadelphia Convention, the Constitutional Convention. They were well-bred, well-fed, well-read, and well-wed, and so they were some of the most powerful and influential Americans that we had. Many of them had money, had ties to wealthy families, intelligent, and they had wonderful wives. Actually, their wives were part of important families. They might have been wonderful, I'm not sure. Okay, what did they do? What were their jobs before coming to the convention? Many of them were lawyers, merchants, shippers, land speculators, moneylenders. So they're pretty powerful positions or jobs that they held. And they were quite young. The average age was only 42 years old, and a lot of them had experience in terms of politics, and trying to make America better. Some of the goals of the convention were preserving and strengthening the young republic, but not by popular democracy. So they did not want everybody to have the right to vote. They wanted the republic to be led by the best people, the wealthier people, the best men. But they did want to preserve the Union, keep it together, prevent anarchy that Shays' Rebellion almost led to, and preserve the life, liberty, and property against mobocracy. And mobocracy refers to that the poor, that the masses of people were to lead a government. And the people at the convention were very fearful of this because they thought we could eventually have a bloody revolution like in France in the 1790s. And indirectly, Daniel Shays was considered a founding father. Now, he's not really a founding father, so in an A-Push exam, don't say he was a founding father. But his actions, scaring the government, scaring the leaders, did help lead to the new Constitution. Okay, next section, hammering out a bundle of compromises, and the key term here is compromises. The Constitution was filled with compromises, eventually helped get it passed. So when the delegates meet in Philadelphia, again, we said that they decided to scrap the Articles. They threw it out the window and decided to write a completely new Constitution. And there's a couple different plans that were offered to be the new Constitution. The larger states, or the most populous states, created the Virginia Plan. I would highlight that, saying that the largest state should have the most power or representation in Congress. Small states came up with the New Jersey Plan. They felt that in Congress it should be equal representation. So there'd be the same number of votes for each state despite their population size. So from these two plans, the Great Compromise is created. I would highlight this. This is also called the Connecticut Compromise. We want to write that down off this side. Great Compromise, Connecticut Compromise, the same thing. And basically we came up with a two-house Congress. The upper house was going to be called the Senate, and there'd be equal representation, which is what we have today, 2 senators from every state. The House of Representatives was going to be the lower house, and it was going to be based on proportional representation. It's based on the population. So the biggest populated states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, they would have more representatives in this house. They also instituted a strong independent executive branch, independent of Congress, and that was going to be the president. So that was created here. And perhaps the worst thing potentially was the Electoral College was created. That was created to decide how we're going to choose the president. So every state would have electors that would vote for the president, and basically this was based on the number of representatives in Congress. And frankly, today people still criticize the Electoral College, like, why do we have it, why do we have it? I think we have it because we like to look at maps, and it's a lot easier to see. It's more exciting drama, I guess, when you can see the map of like which state, or which president every state decides to vote for. The last major compromise was the Three-Fifths Compromise. I would highlight this So the slaves in every state would count 3/5 of a person. Now we know slaves are actually real people, but in terms of representation in the House, they would count for 3/5. And so this was designed to make the southern states especially happy because they had more slaves. Also, I would highlight this, the slave trade, the external slave trade, meaning bringing slaves from Africa, was going to be abolished in 1808. So this did happen. Otherwise, slavery was never mentioned in the Constitution. This is probably not a good idea because 70 years later or so, we basically have a civil war over slavery that the Founding Fathers did not want to mention or talk about because they were afraid that many Southerners would not support the Constitution, so they left it alone. Next section is safeguards for conservatism, and so the Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention did want to protect their property and probably did try to benefit the wealthier more than every other American. So a lot of the Founding Fathers at the convention, they did have a lot of the same economic agreements, and they believed that we need to have a sound money, so they did not want to print a ton of money, which will lead to high inflation, and they wanted to protect private property because that became very important to them. Politically, a stronger central government with 3 separate branches created checks and balances, so this is a good thing. This is a good American belief. Also, the delegates were against manhood suffrage, and this means that any man could vote regardless if they owned property. So the delegates wanted to have the property holders be the only ones to vote, and that's the way it was in America really up until the 1820s. The House of Representatives, maybe I would highlight this as well, was the only part of the government created by the Constitution that was elected directly by the people. Everything else, the Senate, the President, and the Supreme Court justices were not elected by the people. And the founders tried to adhere to the 2 great principles of republicanism, this idea that only a legitimate government is based on the consent of the people, and the powers of the government should be limited. And so that's what they did try to do to appease, especially the states' rights people. And so in September of 1787, 42 delegates remained till the end, and 3 of them refused to sign the final document, like, I want no part of that Constitution. So we had 39 people sign the Constitution, then they headed to the city tavern to hang out and talk more politics and have a glass of ale. The next section, clash of the Federalist AntiFellows, highlight these 2 things you need to know, these 2 groups of people. So in order to ratify the Constitution, and this means to make it become the law of the land, we need to have 9 of the 13 states. And so every state would have their own convention. So this is after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Every state goes back, has their own convention with their leading politicians, and they will decide to either vote for or against the new Constitution. And so 2 political groups emerge during the ratification process, the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. Highlight these two groups. The Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution. It's a must-know. Many of them were for states' rights. Many of them were like backcountry, near the mountains, not as educated. The poorer classes were more against the Constitution. Some of the leaders of this group included Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. The Federalists, highlight them, they were for the Constitution, and they were the founders that were there, the framers of the Constitution. Their common characteristics included many of them were wealthier property holders. Many of them were along the coast region in the bigger cities. So these 2 different groups clashed. And so the Anti-Federalists, their biggest problem is that the states weren't strong enough, and especially the Anti-Federalists felt that there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution to protect people's liberties. The table on page 180 that kind of shows the evolution of the Union, how we got to writing the Constitution, and these are some time periods over here and some major events that led to the 13 separate colonies to eventually come together to form one great country. So in 1643 to 1684, the first sign of unity was the New England Confederation for the New England colonies to join together and fight against Native Americans. From 1686 to 1689, the Dominion of New England was created by England, and this tried to control the colonies of this region, and the colonists banded together and showed some unity to try to get rid of Sir Edmund Andros. More unity occurred in 1754 during the start of the French and Indian War with the creation of the Albany Congress. Then in 1765, that year should be important to you. The Stamp Act Congress was created to try to rebel against the Stamp Act. Next, from 1772 to 1776, the Committees of Correspondence were created by Sam Adams to continue anti-British propaganda throughout the colonies. And then in 1774, the First Continental Congress was created in response to the Intolerable Acts and to create the association among the colonists to boycott British goods. And then from 1775 to 1781, Second Continental Congress was created to lead America during the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. And then from 1781 to 1787 to maybe 1789, you should know this one, was in this chapter. The Articles of Confederation becomes our first government for the United States, although it was very ineffective because of the lack of power to tax or regulate commerce. And then finally, the greatest thing was created in 1789, and that was the Constitution was finally ratified and became the law of the land. 3 more sections of reading. The next section is the Great Debate in the States, and so we're talking about the ratification process, and we know that each state had to ratify it, and there were special elections were held in some of the states, and the first 4 states to ratify the Constitution were the small states. Anyone want to guess who the first state was? The first small state was Delaware. They were proud to be the first state to ratify the Constitution. Massachusetts was one of the most important of the first 9 because that was the second largest in population at the time, and it was very divided. The vote was pretty close between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and so we say that Massachusetts is like an acid test. So if Massachusetts could pass and ratify the Constitution, most likely the rest will. Which man in Massachusetts indirectly pushed them to ratify? This man was not part of the convention, but this man did create Shays' Rebellion. That was Daniel Shays. Look at the chart on page 182 to show all the states when they ratified it, and you don't have to memorize all of them, but I think you should know definitely Massachusetts was important, and which were the last 2 big states that still had to ratify it, because New Hampshire did become the 9th one to ratify the Constitution, but we still had to have the 2 largest states, New York and Virginia, still had to ratify it to make the Constitution become valid. Section, the 4 laggard states. These are the last 4 states to ratify, and the ones that I want to focus on are New York and Virginia. And so we said New Hampshire was the 9th, and so technically the Constitution did become law, but we had to have these 2 big states to ratify to make it happen. And so they had to, eventually these 2 states and the other 2 had to ratify the Constitution, not because they necessarily wanted to, but because they felt they had to and they could not afford to exist outside the Union of the United States. Highlight this huge thing in A push. So the Federalist Papers were created to persuade New York and Virginia to actually ratify the Constitution. And the Federalist Papers, they were a series of essays written to get Americans to support the ratification of our Constitution. And I want to highlight these 2 people, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. These are the 2 main writers. John Jay did as well, but not as important. And these 2 guys were able to persuade enough Americans, especially New York and Virginia, through their Federalist Papers to support the Constitution. We already talked about Rhode Island. Yeah, leave it at that. This section is called a conservative triumph, and so a minority won twice. It won the Revolution, minority group of people, and also minority group supported the Constitution, and it won in America. The majority had not been considered. Okay, and so again, this was led by the leaders, the conservatives, the property classes were able to help create this Constitution. All right, so the conservative ideas won out with the writing of the Constitution, meaning the wealthy won, and it's safeguarded, were put in place to control mobocracy and anarchy. And especially Shays' Rebellion probably will not exist anymore. The federal government is strong enough to put it down. Radicals and anti-federalists such as Patrick Henry, who helped push Britain out of the United States, were upended. They've lost with their Constitution. And you can say that it was like a peaceful counter-revolution. So the Constitution went against the majority, but they're able to get it passed for a more stronger central government. It did restore economic and political stability of the colonial years, and so it does. Our new government does provide for more stability economically. And then the 3 great things about our Constitution is we have separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. We have checks and balances between the different branches of government, and the Bill of Rights were added after the Constitution was ratified. The first 10 amendments would provide certain rights for all Americans, certain freedoms that we hold so dear. And these would be added during the first Congress around 1790, 1791. Let's look at this map on page 183, and this is the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are in green, the Antis are in yellow. So if you notice, most of the green Federalist areas are along the coastline. Most of the Anti-Federalist supporters are in the back country especially, and you see that there's definitely some division between these 2 groups in terms of geography, and the final 2 states, or the 2 most important big states. New York had a large amount of anti-Federalists there. So it's kind of surprising that they actually did ratify it, and Virginia had a lot of anti-Federalists as well.